Oh, sorry. My name's Alex. Oh, yeah. Well, you can get Hi everyone, this is Alex with Unicorn Riot. We're here live in Denver, Colorado at the Glenarm Rec Center. There's a meeting hosted by the Denver Justice Project here to talk about reimagining policing along with public safety. So there's about 30 people here in the community attending tonight, and there are going to be panelists speaking on that issue. So we will be here live during the entire event. Thank you for tuning in. If you want to check out our other coverage, you can also just visit unicornriot.ninja.
Good evening. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining this meeting. We thank Reimagining Policing and Public Safety for creating a space where people can speak the language of their heart and creating language justice. My name is Maria Martinez, and this afternoon I will be your interpreter. If you need to be interpreter, or if you're not bilingual, please raise your hand and I will let you have a device so you can be part of the meeting. We also thank CLC for bringing this space as well. So just if you want to be interpreted, please raise your hand and I will be there for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. I want to thank everybody for coming this evening. My name is Alexander Landau. I am the founder and the director of community relations for the Denver Justice Project. But we have a variety of organizations in the house this evening. A lot of you are probably wondering why we are here. What is the point of having this community meeting? Before we dive into that, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping rules. For one, we have food, we have refreshments out front, sandwiches, half turkey, half vegetarian. We also have LaCroix and bottled water, help yourselves. Those are for the folks in attendance and the folks in the rec center. Restrooms are right out front for folks both male and female. I don't believe there are gender neutral restrooms here, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask and we can get those squared away. The staff at the front has also been quite helpful. So why are we here this evening? There has been quite a few things that have transpired in our communities over the past several years. Because of the seriousness of these issues that have been happening in the realms of law enforcement accountability, crisis response, etc. It's been almost a year and a half since Denver's had an independent monitor. This is an entity responsible for the oversight of police and sheriff. In the early 6 months of this year, we have already made 1,000 arrests out front of Union Station downtown, most of these being low-level drug offenses. And we have some very serious legislation that is rolling out, impacting our communities beginning as early as tomorrow. So these are some of the reasons that we're here today. We also have some very, very serious work going on in the space of sanctuary. For folks who don't understand what that is, our brothers and sisters of different cultural backgrounds are just as impacted when it comes to racial profiling as our indigenous folks, our black brothers and sisters, and our lower income white community members. Before we pivot into that, there is a pretty serious piece of legislation that I do believe a lot of folks in this room have heard about, or at least heard people discussing, or I'm sure have questions about. And if you haven't heard about this at all, it's imperative that you do. It is HB 22-1326, and this is the Fentanyl Accountability and Prevention Bill, and this was sponsored by Rep. Garnett and Senator Patterson and Koch. This passed with 35 yeses and 30 noes in the House, and this also passed with 27 yeses in the Senate and 8 noes. So there is no secret that Denver is suffering, and communities around the country are suffering from an opiate crisis, from overdoses, from a drug called fentanyl. This isn't the first time that our communities have seen these types of epidemics. We've seen this with heroin, we've seen this with prescriptions, we've seen this with other narcotics. But this bill that community members and also police chiefs, district attorneys have been fighting tooth and nail, some to pass and some to squash, successfully passed and rolls out tomorrow. And these are some of the highlights of this bill. This is some of the information that we believe our community should know. And there will be a deeper dive into this information through CCJRC at a later point in time. So stay tuned for that as well. But bottom line is, this bill creates new drug weight cut points specifically for fentanyl. Meaning 4 grams of fentanyl previously to the passing of this bill would have been a felonious charge. That's now been reduced to 1 gram. So possession of 1 gram of fentanyl will be a felonious charge. And we believe, the best of our ability to understand, these pills weigh roughly 0.1. So 10 of these pills would be a felonious charge. For folks who understand addiction, 10 pills is not even enough for a personal user to get to the end of the day. All right, so this is a break for users, but this is also punishment. This is punishment disguised as safety. All right, this reduces the amount of fentanyl an individual can have on their person and be charged feloniously. However, this bill is not supposed to carry felonious consequences. So say you are charged with felony possession of fentanyl, you still should receive misdemeanor convictions, meaning there should be no prison time attached, there should be a jail sentence, and there are other parameters and conditions depending on the amount and the specifications of the charge. The second thing to understand here is that this bill creates a variety of new felonious distribution charges, some that even include specific sentencing for people who are caught distributing fentanyl in a case where somebody dies. This bill also creates a new drug felony 1. These are crimes of importing more than 4 grams of fentanyl into the state of Colorado, and there are different penalties if you're caught with a pill press, so on and so forth. But the big thing to take away from that particular checkpoint is that this is opening up a door for a variety of new felonious convictions for people who suffer from substance use disorder, people who are better in the care of programs like STAR, programs that we'll hear more from this evening, but basically people who focus with a harm reduction approach instead of a criminal justice-based approach. This bill allocates approximately $20 million to purchase naloxone and $600,000 to purchase testing strips This bill also provides another $10 million for medication for opiate use disorder. So this is anything from Vivitrol to naloxone to Narcan, other methods that they use to wean people off of opiates, and provides an additional $6 million to the harm reduction grant program. So in total, this is about $36.5 million that are going to be coming down into the state of Colorado, both on a federal and a state level, to allegedly combat or to further criminalize, in some cases, people who are suffering from substance use disorder. This is also very concerning because a portion of this bill requires studies by an independent contractor be published no later than July 31st of 2025. The Behavioral Health Administration impacts analysis of making possession a felony. And what does creating felonious possession charges do for the reduction of use, the reduction of violence, and the omission of voluntary treatment? As we've seen in the past, and as it currently stands now, felonies do not deter people from committing crime, especially if it is to aid a disease that you're suffering from. So I think this is something, and as we talk further, we'll understand the danger of mapping things like overdoses, of mapping things like undocumented individuals, mapping things like lower income crime statistics, star calls, things like that, and the dangers that can have in our communities. The overdose mapping, the EMS law enforcement and concerns are encouraged to participate in OD mapping to report incidents of fatal and non-fatal overdoses. So law enforcement allegedly is prohibited from sharing this data. We'll have some very brilliant speakers come up in just a minute who will inform you as to why that should not be believed, because law enforcement loves to share our personal data with other branches of law enforcement and yields convictions, detentions, things like that. But the overdose mapping, one thing that you need to understand is that mapping our abuses furthers our abuses in the hands of these people. So this is a bit about the fentanyl bill. There is more copies of this available. We are going to post this in the chat and look forward for a later presentation brought to you by CCJRC for an in-depth debrief of what this bill is going to do, the expectations, and the fight that we're going to have in front of us moving forward. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and bring Q Fawn, who is the Denver regional organizer from Colorado Immigrants' Rights Coalition, and Raquel to the stage to discuss some of the sanctuary work and the necessary intersections between being undocumented and being a person of color in suffrage in our communities. I'm going to actually turn the mics over to our panelists for their own personal introductions.
Thank you. Hey y'all, I'm Raquel Ariano, pronouns she, her, ella, and I'm the policy manager with the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. And I'll be here mostly for questions.
And hi everyone, I'm Q. I am the Denver regional organizer with the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, and I go by she, they. Should I just get started? Yes. Okay. And we were here today to kind of talk about the intersectional issues that we see between immigration and criminal justice overall. And just a little bit about CIRC before we begin. CIRC is a coalition made up of about 70 to 80 organizations across all of Colorado, and we work to make policy and advocacy, like any sort of legislation that would benefit immigrant populations here in the state. And as we have grown over the years, we've seen this continuous need to kind of think about immigration on a broader issue than just as a silo kind of intersection movement in itself. And one of the things that we've been kind of researching with a project with Mi Gente, an organization, along with a lot of really amazing organizations across Colorado, is that law enforcement here in Colorado are using backdoor data brokers to still find information of our undocumented immigrant communities across all of Colorado, and they're using excuses as of it being public information to kind of get away with it. And before we begin with all of that, I kind of wanted to break down a little bit the history of Colorado. If for folks who don't really know, Colorado actually used to be one of the most anti-immigrant states. We were pretty much up there with Arizona and Georgia. And this was because up until 1999, a lot of our undocumented community members were able to access a driver's license. And so when 1999 came around, we passed a law that pretty much barred them from doing so. And you can see, kind of imagine all the issues that come about when folks need to go to work, when folks need to drop off their children at school. And what made it worse was in 2006, we passed what was known as the Senate Bill 90, also called the Show Me Your Papers law. And this was pretty much a free pass for law enforcement to racially profile anyone they suspected of being undocumented. So if, say a police kind of see someone driving down the street, they say, oh, look, they're brown, they must be undocumented, they can pull them over. And that kind of created this relationship and this really deep, intentional connection between this prison to deportation pipeline that we're seeing. And what made it worse throughout all of this is in 2012, we had Colorado became part of this federal program where we were sharing information such as fingerprints and names, and that gave ICE access to all of that information for anyone they wanted to target. So they would call jails and prisons and say, hey, you have someone that we're really interested in, can you hold them for over 48 hours in case they're being released, and just leave them there for us so we can come pick them up and put them in deportation process. You can obviously kind of just imagine how toxic that was for our community and how that created a lot of fear mongering. And from there, that kind of became the catalyst of where communities came together and said, hey, enough is enough, in theory, police and law enforcement are supposed to serve and protect the people, right? And you're not doing so. So where is this line that where is this protection that you're promising us? So they came together in 2013 and they collected so many testimonies and stories of communities across the board to show that we can't come to police to trust them anymore. We can't come to you, for our crimes in case of domestic violence or anything across the board. They can't come to their court dates because of this fear that they're going to get deported. And it was because of all these testimonies and stories that came about that we were actually able to repeal the SB 90 law that was put into place, which was a really exciting win because that also led us up into 2014 where the relationship that we were trying to build with sheriffs across all of the state, the 64 counties, we were able to get their commitment to make sure that they were not uphold what's known as detaining immigration requests, pretty much detainers, which allowed ICE to kind of communicate with them and say, again, hey, you have someone that we're interested in, can you hold them? So that was really exciting. That was a really big win for us, and that kind of developed a much safer, in a sense, relationship that we had with law enforcement, with our undocumented and just immigrant communities alike. Unfortunately, when you have every step forward, there's two steps back. When Obama also came into office, he replaced the program that we were talking about earlier, the Secure Communities, and replaced it with something called the PEPCOM, which is the Priority Enforcement program instead. And what was supposed to be seen as kind of like a, how would you say, kind of a lesser program that benefited more of the community so folks won't get into deportation, it pretty much instead criminalized folks with any kind of background that relates them to the jails or prisons. So, this is where we see the really big shift in over 2 million undocumented people being deported back under the Obama administrative office years. And should I pause for a second? Okay. So you can kind of see this back and forth, right? That we're law enforcement has been playing around with us. Luckily, because of this relationship that we keep seeing between law enforcement sharing all these really personal, public yes, but personal information of our communities to ICE, we finally came to a point where in 2019 we passed a law, the House Bill 1124, which pretty much allowed us to limit any sort of limit as much collaboration between ICE and law enforcement as possible. And through this bill, they were mandated to give the advisement of rights, so your Miranda rights, to anyone who is leaving the jails. And they were forced to make sure that they are not upholding any sort of immigration detainer requests without a judicial warrant, and they're also not able to share any sort of information around like probation without that warrant again. And you'll see a lot of times that ICE will come to law enforcement with something other than a warrant to kind of bypass all the sanctuary policies put into place. And with that, this is where we're led up to today. Kind of taking it back from the very beginning, CERC started around driver's licenses because of the bar that people were, forced to uphold with the bill that came into place. And so one of our committees, they focus specifically on driver's licenses. We were able to put in, what was it called? A Colorado.
We did a Colorado open records request.
Yes, which pretty much makes them share any information that comes that has been shared between different agencies. And we found out that the DMV has been having a direct conversation with ICE agents in general, and it's pretty bad. We would see things like them signing things off saying "Happy hunting," in regards to a lot of our undocumented communities who are finally coming to the DMVs to get their driver license again. And through this kind of again was the next catalyst for how we came about with this new report around sanctuary policies, and finding out that now Colorado is in a place where it shares information one of two ways with data brokers and indirectly to ICE. And one of it is through specifically Denver and I believe El Paso County. They are working to share directly with a platform called LexisNexis, which is a corporation that pretty much just collects and sells data to different clients. And a lot of these data are things that are your home addresses, your driver's license plate, your real-time phone number. And so they're getting all these information directly from the law enforcement here in Colorado. And the other way is through something called the Colorado Vine, which was set up to be specifically more of a victims notification, so families can have access to know oh, this is what's happening, this is how I kind of keep up to date with my family member who's in the prison at the moment. Instead, what's happening is that Colorado Vine is also becoming another way for law enforcement to kind of share information into the Vine, which is a program underneath what's called APRIS Solution, which is another database that pretty much just shares real-time information. So whenever someone's being released, whenever someone is paying bail. So again, APRIS Solution is collecting all of that through Colorado Vine, and then they are selling that back to LexisNexis. And ICE is a client of LexisNexis. So you're seeing this indirect communication with ICE agencies and law enforcement, and how they're kind of getting around this really big sanctuary policy that we put into place by these third parties, data brokers, selling this information that is so-called public. And obviously, for a lot of our communities members, it doesn't matter if something is private or public. It's pretty much the make it or break it deal of whether someone stays with their family here or not. So we've been trying to have a lot of communications with Sheriff Diggins for the Denver Sheriff Department, and he actually did indicate that they are sharing this information, so we do have that confirmed, and that this program is also being used by the Denver Police. And so we are hoping to have a conversation with Chief Payson in this upcoming month or so, I believe, to kind of continue that conversation and see where exactly can we draw the line and make sure that Colorado is stopping this contract that we are under with LexisNexis and stopping a lot of this information sharing that is putting our communities at risk. And we're also trying to work with City Council as well, who is a part of the contract that's put into place to make sure that we're stopping any funding from being a part of it, and again, canceling that contract as much as possible. I think that's it.
No, and so I would just add to that, one thing you got to understand, whether we are utilizing things like SB 90s or HB 1070s or broken windows policing, when we're legalizing profiling, to allegedly prevent crime or allegedly check somebody's status. If I get profiled when I leave this rec center tonight, it could result in me being hurt or killed. It could result in me being falsely imprisoned. It could result in a number of things. If say for example, because what does an undocumented person even look like, right? The immediate picture that oftentimes is painted is our Latinx brothers and sisters, when actually we have a heavy Haitian population that's sitting in ICE detention right now. You know, we have a variety. One of the most diverse school districts in the United States is Aurora Public Schools, speaking over 136 languages. So I'm confused as to what an undocumented person is supposed to look like. But if I end up being profiled and end up in custody versus ICE detention, what we need to understand that these are two sides of the same criminal justice system. We are not alone out here, and we should not isolate individuals who specifically get profiled and have a different outcome. There was a period in this city where black and brown organizers, where black and brown community members, black and brown communities fought and worked together, and that's where we need to get back to. So I appreciate you all sharing. Is there anything you'd like to add, Rucka, please?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. So the core request that we found, just to like clear it up for folks here, we actually were able to pass a bill to shut off direct communication between Colorado departments and ICE. So that's huge, like no more of that like buddy. Yeah. So we passed SB 21-131. But this is like the final frontier, right? Like as you close off that direct communication, like ICE has been anticipating this, and like the criminal justice system, they anticipate like those that invest in profiting off of people's pain, they're thinking ahead, right? And so like they are using these loopholes, and it's like very cutting edge. We're at the beginning of this. There aren't many states that have closed off these loopholes, and so it's a big battle, but I think there's a lot of intersections.
Thank you both. And what we're going to do for Q&A, is there any immediate Q&A in the audience while folks are here? Yes.
So isn't Denver supposed to be a sanctuary city, and how does that play into what's happening right now? Like, can you educate us on the difference in what's happening? Denver is supposed to be a sanctuary city.
So the question was, isn't Denver supposed to be a sanctuary city, and how come the sanctuary laws are not being honored?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So in 2017, Denver became like a sanctuary city, right, by passing an ordinance. And what it did was it basically said that like, you know, Denver police is not going to work with ICE, right? Like they don't have a 287G agreement. But what Denver hasn't done is they haven't stopped ICE notifications. So they are still like sharing. If ICE calls and says, hey, I want to know when so-and-so is getting out, like they're not going to hold that person for them, but they're going to give them everything they need to know to come pick up that person. And so Denver's still doing that, and that hasn't been stopped by the policies that we passed. And so that's also what we're getting from the sheriff is that, well, this is public information, you know, but they are going out of their way to make this easier for ICE.
And then you have to think, when discussing these overdose mapping trigger points that this fentanyl bill is trying to collect, look at what it's already done to our undocumented brothers and sisters. Look at what crime maps have done to places like 5 Points where we're at, like Northeast Park Hill, like Montbello. These are weaponized tools that have been utilized for separation. Is there anything else the two of you would like to add? Are there any additional questions? And if you think of something and you'd like to ask it later and we're rolling, just save it till the end, because we're going to have a discussion, a Q&A portion where folks in the audience will get to deliver their feedback and opinions as well. But thank you both for coming up here. And I, for the sake of time, can we give them a quick round of applause so we can keep this rolling? So as we think about what racial profiling really is and what that does, and what criminality really consists of, what is actually crime. Denver has had a rising homeless population for a very long time. We have had an opiate crisis for a very long time. As we all know, behavioral health issues are real in our communities. They are real in the criminal justice system, and they are certainly exacerbated under times of extreme trauma. And we know that the criminal justice system is not the best agency to be housing treatment-based services for people in suffrage. Our next group of panelists, I want to bring up Vinny Cervantes. Vinny Cervantes is the director of Dasher and is also a member of the SCAC, which is an expansion committee for the entity STAR. And I'd also like to bring up Sean Bernadette. Did I say that correctly? Hope so. He is also a committee member with the expansion team, along with myself as well. And Dr. Davis, I'll probably loop you in on parts of this conversation. In relation to where this subject is going to go, several years ago, we as a community and in collaboration with members of the city piloted and launched what is now known as STAR, the Support Team Assisted Response. And what this does is it removes law enforcement from issues involving homelessness, issues involving substance use disorder, issues involving behavioral health. And Vinny has been here since the very beginning, since this was an idea, since we had a small delegation go to Eugene, Oregon, and study the CAHOOTS model, community assistance helping out on the streets, and what they've done and the successes that they've had. Vinny, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear your perspective on how STAR came to be, where we're currently at, and then some of the barriers that we've currently been faced with.
Does this one work? We'll try this one. Yeah, thank you, Alexander, and thank you all for being here. My name again is Vinny Cervantes, he, him, with Dasher, Denver Alliance for Street Health Response, and we are also on, or I am also on the STAR Advisory Committee along with Alexander and Sean. And Dasher was founded in 2018 with the explicit goal to create a program like CAHOOTS, as Alexander mentioned. CAHOOTS has been around for 30 years in Eugene, Oregon, and over that time, they have sent community members who are trained in emergency medical response and mental health response to crisis calls instead of law enforcement. And so in doing so, they've been able to have a more appropriate, more support-driven response to crises like issues related to behavioral health, mental health, substance use, and homelessness. But they've also been able to save the city of Eugene money overall, about $8.7 million per year, by having an alternative response to police. And so we had that explicit goal to bring that program to Denver in 2018. And while we were doing that, we decided that there's a much larger spectrum of interrupting the criminalization of our community that goes beyond the moment of crisis and the moment where an officer shows up. And so we have expanded that spectrum of what we do as an organization, which also includes restorative justice on the back end, transformative justice, and on the front end, guaranteeing basic human needs, community support, and infrastructure such as employment and education, and things like food security, housing security, and access to health care are all components of public safety that we work on to create programs that interrupt the moment where the criminal justice system has been utilized to address those situations in our community. So in doing so, we have been currently working with about 14 cities in Colorado to launch what is similar to CAHOOTS, and our most successful efforts have been in Denver with the STAR program launched in 2020 on June 1st, and the AMRT program in Aurora called Aurora Mobile Response Team, which launched officially last September. So we're coming up on almost a year of that program. And both programs replace police by sending a paramedic and a clinician to crises, low-level crises that involve, again, mental health, substance use, and homelessness. So this program, STAR, has been on the ground since June 1st of 2020, and it's largely been very successful. They've already responded to over 4,000 calls that would otherwise have used a police officer instead of these clinicians and medics. There's undoubtedly a lot of success to be found out of this program. A study was released a few weeks ago by Stanford, which shows that this program, in its first 6 months of its pilot, had not only reduced crime by about 36% in the areas that it was serving, but that it also saved the city money by having a response that cost about a fourth of the cost of police response, which would traditionally be used to address these issues in our community. And so there's, again, a lot of success to be found in the program, and the community mechanism to oversee this program currently exists as a STAR community Community Advisory Committee, and that's what all three of us sit on currently. However, there's still a lot to be desired of this program because it is still not what we envisioned. We have had a mantra as we have demanded more community oversight and ownership of this program, that is to say that STAR is the compromise. It was not the vision, and so we are intent on creating that vision, and what we wanted to realize was STAR being a true alternative to policing. So there are still discrepancies in the program, one being that there is still a chance that if you try to call STAR, that police will show up. Another discrepancy is that STAR has been used in some cases to substitute for the co-response program, which co-responder program is a police officer and a clinician paired together. And so the STAR program is being used to support a much older, much more well-resourced program when it's still very new and is supposed to be an explicit alternative to policing. I also think that there's a lot of discrepancies with how this program serves our community as BIPOC communities, as people that have lived experience with homelessness and substance use, because the data doesn't reflect the needs of our community. The first 6 months of the pilot, over 30% of the people they contacted were not registered with racial or ethnic identity, which means that we can't understand the impact on communities that are disproportionately targeted by the criminal justice system if we don't know who's being contacted by STAR. Currently, the people that they're contacting do not represent the diversity of Denver, and there are people at the administrative level of STAR who are barriers to community ownership, disregarding of the community leaders that have been part of this process, and frankly have acted with some degree of racism and bias when it comes to our communities and the voices that we hold. And so when we look at the data and we see that there are not nearly as many Latinos being contacted that represent the diversity of our city, there's not nearly as many black folks being contacted and helped that represent the diversity of a city like Denver, then we have to look at the dispatchers and who they're sending and when they're sending the STAR program versus a police response or a co-response to crises in our city. And so we have demands of STAR that include, more community ownership of the program, full transparency of the decisions that they're making, and overall to be a true alternative to police by removing the affiliation with STAR or with SET program and policing overall. SET being a version of policing that is being billed as a community responder program like STAR, and I'm sure we'll talk more about SET, so I don't know if I'll talk about that now, but our demands as Dasher are not just the demands that entail the STAR program and being one that we want to be more of a community-driven, community-owned program, but also demands for SET to be dissolved. We do not want that program in our community. It is a distortion of community demands to have people responding to crisis instead of law enforcement. But we know that we're not going to wait for the city to listen to our demands, because the reality is they don't listen to us and they don't wait for us to give input before they make decisions. And so in the meantime, while we fight for a better program with STAR and while we fight to dissolve the SET program, Dasher is working on an alternative to 911 called the Patch app with our partner Rahim, which is a national organization. We are piloting this app with 3 other cities, Cambridge, Minneapolis, and Oakland, for true community responder autonomous programs where we will use an app to send our responders to crises instead of police. It won't be attached to the city in any way. It won't be attached to 911. It will be in many ways like Uber, where you can request a support and somebody will show up to help you. And so we are in the process of launching that app and our own responder team within Dasher that could be a spectrum of community response that lives on the lower end compared to STAR. And so that's what we're working on in the meantime. So if folks are interested in being able to provide mutual aid to our unhoused community, to be able to provide an infrastructure of material support, and possibly to intervene in situations that might entail behavioral health or substance use crises, then we would love for folks to join this team, because we're working with our partners and our own internal volunteers to make this a reality. So I think that's what I have to say, but I'll pass it off to Alexander.
Vinny, I appreciate that. And so one thing that I think is really important to highlight is the difference between STAR and co-responder models. STAR is in its second year officially, and it's just recently broken the multi-million-dollar threshold as far as the first of its kind, to be frank, but also as an alternative and a much more experienced response to these particular crises than law enforcement. We have this entity, SET, Street Enforcement Team, and SET has been on my radar only a handful of months. And Vinny, correct me if I'm wrong, but it hasn't been on your radar for about more than a year. Is that about right? So when you think about something like SET, and what SET is basically an extension of Denver Police. So SET responds. These are not post-certified, so peace officer standards and training certified officers. These are city employees who have a uniform, who carry mace, and who carry handcuffs, but in their job description are asked if they have the ability to take life away, and also if they have the ability to resuscitate somebody who has experienced something that has taken life away. Not specifying as to what that is, but if these individuals are supposed to be able to take life away but are only issued handcuffs and mace, it makes me wonder, are they expected to carry their own personal firearms? Are they expected to bludgeon our community members to death? And then who is to take accountability for these actions? For me, this spells the exact same problems that we're having with law enforcement, repackaged and redistributed back into our communities. When we see the hurdles for a program like STAR, how many years, and the uphill climb, the community input, the listening sessions to get to where it's at today, but something like SET can pop up overnight and already has a $4.5 million budget. And these are individuals who, the only reason they weren't out harassing unhoused folks in encampment is because they were waiting on their uniforms from the city. So now they are in full swing, and they have oftentimes been confused as a beneficial co-responder model in discussions community is having about STAR. But by no means should we confuse STAR with a co-responder model. It was never intended to be that, and it should never be intended to become that. An entity like SET is dangerous, and it does the community a disservice. It does an entity like STAR a disservice, and is a hindrance to it actually reaching its full potential as a monumental pioneered program. I want to get some input from Sean, who is another member, very, very well versed in the SET program and in the inner workings of STAR and what we've been dealing with internally, but just to add some more perspective to some of the things that have currently been unfolding in these monthly meetings.
Thanks. What's up, everybody? My name's Sean. I'm a social worker. I work in the Juvenile Detention Center out in Lakewood, providing therapy to our youth that are incarcerated. And I agree with some of what was said earlier. These facilities are not the ideal places to be providing these services. I would like to just elaborate briefly, very briefly. Criminal justice is not the same as prevention. Criminal justice is doing nothing to prevent the crimes and harms caused in our communities to our citizens. It is trying and failing, frankly, to clean up the mess afterward. And programs like STAR are trying to get on the front end of this stuff and provide needed services that can avert criminal justice involvement to people struggling with these low-level kind of afflictions, right? Non-violent afflictions. So much of this stuff is intertwined. The recent fentanyl bill is horrible, and we've seen, we have data going back years about the impacts of these types of things on communities of color, marginalized communities, and the legacy of that, right? The legacy of the war on drugs we are still living through. And here we are again. So anyway, I joined this committee 6 months ago. I saw an application process for it that speaks directly to the things I am interested in, and so I applied and was gratefully accepted to participate. We've been meeting monthly with the Department of Public Health and Environment, DDPHE, and throughout the whole process it has become extremely clear that we are there as a symbol of community, but we have really no power. This was meant to be a community-driven, community-owned, community-controlled process. There was a draft charter that was presented at the beginning of these meetings with that language in it, and we have yet to ratify that charter because of resistance from the city to adopt language around community control, right? We keep coming back to this specific phrase in the city's attorney's office taking serious issue with that language. Most recently, we've been seeing this manifested in the conflation between set and star in language used by the mayor and in press releases from DDPHE, so much to the point where people are confusing these programs, right? Which does it a service to star. If you see people out handing out tickets and, you know, carrying mace and handcuffs, you think that's us, you're not going to call us, right? So that inhibits our ability to act effectively in the communities that we are needed. Additionally, the committee voted unanimously 2 months ago now to come out with a statement, you know, denouncing SET and calling for its removal from the city. We made that statement. We received pushback from DDPHE. We went further with a press conference style briefing where some of our members met with members of the press and issued, you know, elaboration on our statement. And we were trying to think of a better word, but attacked by DDPHE, its representatives, and anonymous staff members of the STAR program, just stating that we don't have control, we don't represent the views of STAR, and singling out Vinny specifically, although there were 8 of us there, stating that Vinny does not speak for STAR, Vinny does not control STAR, and we're just being reminded constantly that we're really just sitting at the table. We don't have any kind of say-so on what's going on. And so our committee has been organizing amongst ourselves, and we're really trying to figure out ways that we can hold the city accountable to what STAR's vision was meant to be, right? And that's a work in progress, and we would invite all of you to attend those meetings. They're held monthly, currently being streamed virtually. And there's periods for public comment at the beginning and at the end of those sessions. So we would welcome all of you there, and I think that's all I got.
I really appreciate that, Sean and Vinny. I would also add, oh yes, please, if there are questions, now's the time in relation to this subject before we pivot. Please, yes, sir.
Brian Loma, I appreciate all the work that is going on, Vinny, obviously, for years. I have been really busy though, but recently some efforts to get STAR out of the hands of the police department and into Servicios de la Raza. And I'd like to know what's going on there, or is it dead in the water? Is there movement? Do we need to rally? What's the answer there? Because I understand the and the STAR program, and I agree that it sets horrible, but I want to see the options for STAR to live outside of the police department so they can reach its full potential.
So just a quick recap of the question. STAR being currently housed in DDPHE, there were conversations of it being removed from DDPHE and transitioned into a community-based entity known as Servicios de la Raza, and we want to understand where the movement of that is at. Where are we at as a community, as a city, in reference to taking STAR back from the city and permanently housing this program in the community. Did I capture that correctly? Perfect. I can speak a little bit to it. I know my colleagues have some things to say as well. What was this, 2-3 meetings ago, we had a vote. Actually, Vinny paused the meeting. We did some preliminary organizing. This was a call of roughly 100 people plus us subcommittee members, where we basically called out the folks at DDPHE and in the city who initially were having these conversations with Servicios as to why they stopped. And nobody from behalf of the city or DDPHE stood up and took accountability for ceasing those conversations. But we did get a unanimous vote from the folks on the committee, the 14 of us, that the best housing for a program such as STAR would be in Servicios de la Raza, and we are currently making moves to ensure that that transition is effective and that program be housed in Servicios. But I do know there are some caveats to something like that as well. It won't entirely live as an entity under Servicios, and I know, Vinny, you can speak more to that. But yes, that was a great question, Brian. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I want to just clarify a few things. So it did start under police, and that was our big concern, is like it shouldn't be with police. It's an alternative to police. And so luckily at the end of 2020, City Council moved it to the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment. So it was moved from public safety to DDPHE. And the Servicios issue is like there's two parts of STAR, which is one, the moment of crisis and the moment of contact, which is they contract currently with what used to be called MHCD, now it's called WellPower. And then they also contract with Denver Health for that response. The other piece of STAR is the follow-up services and support, so they don't have that piece contracted yet. And our demand was that that should be contracted with Servicios de la Raza because for 2 attempts, the city put out an RFP of $2.3 million, and because they didn't outreach to the community in the right way, nobody applied for that money. So because the city failed twice to issue that money, we as a committee decided where we wanted the money to go, knowing that the city could maneuver around RFPs because they do it all the time. And so we made the decision that we wanted to see that money, that $2.3 million of the follow-up supports and support services, go to Servicios de la Raza, which, and one of the reasons we also did that is because there was a threat that they were going to move that money instead, the $2.3 million, because they failed to give out the RFP, back to policing by through the aid center, which is being created, which lives under police. You have to fingerprint just to get into the building, and so they check for warrants. That hasn't been created yet, but that was the threat, is they were going to move money for STAR back to policing. And so we said absolutely not. We want the money to go to Servicios de la Raza for the follow-up supports. Supposedly they are moving on that contract right now, but the whole thing still lives under DDPHE. And so ideally, the vision, as I mentioned earlier, wasn't for it to live necessarily under a city agency like that, but to be an autonomous program like Cahoots is under the Whitebird Clinic. So you're right in that that's the demand. We're not there yet, and we know that it's going to take a long time for us to fight for that because the city will not give up this program. But that is the vision, is that we would like it to live with a community-based organization like Servicios, or a partnership of organizations, maybe not even just one, but a partnership of community-based programs. But yeah, there's the two pieces of STAR, but all of it lives under DDPHE right now.
I want to bring in Dr. Davis, who is the founder of the Reimagining Policing and Public Safety Task Force. Just for some perspective, I know the task force has been heavily involved in combating entities like SET and has been paying attention to the expansion of the STAR program. But Dr. Davis, is there anything in relation to the SET program that we're missing here? And why is it a concern of the task force when it comes to potentially another arm of police being created and unleashed on our unhoused brothers and sisters?
Before I answer that question, there was a question that came in the chat that I want to get clarification on, and that is, it is an understanding that STAR is only responding to 1% of the calls that it could potentially respond to, and already with just really being called in on that 1% is already experiencing great results. Is that number, is that 1% accurate? Because the question is about scaling up STAR.
Yeah.
And if we're getting good results with 1%, what would happen if we scaled it up? I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about that. That came from the chat. And then, Alex, I will answer your question directly soon after that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big issues and barriers too, is that the potential of the STAR program is being limited by the co-response program. And so a lot of the calls that the co-response program is answering could be answered by STAR. There's also a lot of calls that STAR is responding to right now that they maybe shouldn't even be answering with regards to homelessness, where people are just existing and people put in calls that they shouldn't be there. So I don't know if 1% is right, but I think it's correct in the sense that STAR is far underachieving what it could potentially achieve in our city. In Eugene, Oregon, the program answers 17% of the calls, 911 calls, using 2% of their safety budget. And so there's way more potential in Denver for what it can do. But yeah, I don't know if 1% is exactly right, but it's probably about that.
Wonderful. And the tenor of stuff, I'm not going to read all the various comments that have been coming in the chat, but the tenor of those comments have just been centering around what I know Dasher, the Task Force to Reimagine Police and Public Safety, has really been trying to focus on, which is how do we minimize and remove law enforcement interaction with citizens, especially and unnecessary interaction with citizens. So I'm going to turn a little bit and try to answer the question that Alex just posed, which is one of the things that many different organizations have attempted to do in the city of Denver, and I think that the task force is a very powerful model in accomplishing, is bringing together community voices to develop solutions. One of the frustrations as I interact with different leaders throughout the city, non-city official leaders that is that oftentimes when this hard work goes into developing community-based solutions, that those suggestions, those recommendations are more or less just pushed to the side, and we continue to revert back to a strong police model of handling public safety. Police are trained with a very specific skill set. They go to the police academy. Whatever your thoughts are, whether you are an abolitionist, a reformer, or whether you are, someone who just says, let's keep the status quo. Police have a very specific function that they do. And so most of the issues that impact our communities do not require someone with a gun and other ammunition and other weaponry responding to it. And so community has come up with solutions. And our concern with the set is, while we are removing guns, which is a good step, I want to give, I see Director Sarate here, I want to tip my hat and say that is a good step to say, okay, we're not going to have people with guns interacting with our unhoused citizens. The challenge is that if you follow the trajectory of SET to its logical conclusion, which is offering having tickets, having individuals with handcuffs, still having that law enforcement mentality around interacting with the unhoused, then you're going to go back to that same model, which is having individuals interacting with law enforcement. So our second concern, and I'll stop here, I can talk, so let me stop here. The second concern is that we gave some strong recommendations, and again, when you look at organizations like Dash, and when you look at other ones, and I reference them because they're here, when you look at the Task Force to Reimagine Police and Public Safety, what you see is a consortium of community organizations coming together. What we asked of the Department of Safety was to reach out to individuals in this city who are doing work around homelessness. Denver has some of the best outreach and service providers for the unhoused community in the nation. So we need to be reaching out to them and saying, hey, listen, you're doing the work. You know what it takes to be successful. You know what these various communities need. Rather than us telling you what we're going to do and then bringing you to a meeting, to your point, Sean, correct? It's Sean, right? To your point, Sean, rather than bringing us to a meeting to rubber stamp what you've already decided to do in the first place, how about come to these leaders, these people who are doing dynamic work already, and then ask them, how should this look? And that's one of our major concerns with the set, is that the program was introduced, and then a handful of people who I have not been able to identify what actual providers to the unhoused community was actually interacted with, and I've asked that question several times. But rather than bringing in somebody on the back end and saying, we've already decided what we're going to do, we just want to run it past you and we'll ask what you think. We're going to do it anyway, but hey, we're just going to run it past you real quick. Rather than do that, how about we flip that model? And that's why, it's so important to have you here tonight so that we can hopefully apply the type of pressure to flip that model, get community input on the front end so that it looks like it's supposed to look. I know I took a detour, but I wanted to get those points out.
I appreciate that, Dr. Davis. Thank you. And thank you, Vinny, and thank you, Sean. One thing I just want to say before we transition is we cannot incarcerate ourselves out of these issues. We cannot hide people specifically because they are undesirable in the eyes of some. These are community members. These are our community members. And the best way to address these problems is holistically and with a harm reduction approach. SET should not be an entity associated with STAR. In fact, in my opinion, it should be dissolved entirely. I only speak for myself when I say that, but there are other entities out here in the community. There are other entities that are geared to circumvent the criminal justice system, to offer different levels of diversion with a housing first method. But before we dive into that, I want to ask, are there any other questions? Yes.
At the last STAR committee meeting, it sounded like SET was being put into the same departmental organizational charge as STAR. And when this came up in a similar conversation about the AIDS Center, right, and STAR and the AIDS Center were discussed as like, we're going to be competing, the AIDS Center is going to be competing with STAR for funding. So I agree with all that you're saying, right, about the problems of SET, and it would be problematic if they're in the same department and therefore competing for funding. So can you speak to that? Is that happening? Is there fear that that is going to happen?
I have a couple of things. Let me just get on there. Sure. I think there's always a fear when it comes to money that agendas will get convoluted. What we've been told right now is that these programs are separate. They're just specifically housed in the same building. But then you have to wonder how a budget can go from, or how it can go from an idea to a $4.5 million budget when it took STAR, several years to get to where it's at. And I think for me personally, that's part of the reason why we're at the subcommittee meetings and doing the work as diligently as we are, to ensure that there isn't inappropriate intersections occurring with the money. But that's my perspective, and I'll let my colleagues speak to that as well.
Yeah, there were a lot of concerns brought up about the AIDS Center and funding because the STAR was represented by the STAR Operations Director in a presentation to City Council about the AIDS Center, and that was where they said, we could be competing for funding against each other. With regards to SET, our committee made a statement that we oppose any affiliation, association, or collaboration between STAR and SET because it confuses our community. It's a distortion of our program. There are 13 values that undergird the STAR program that SET, frankly, is in opposition to or contradiction to. And so when we made that statement, DDPHE agreed with some elements of it, but when we wanted to bring it up at that last meeting, we were actually told initially that public safety had to be there for us to talk about it. And I think that establishes another level of confusion, that somehow DDPHE is beholden to public safety to even talk about their program STAR and what it does with other programs. And so we talked about it anyway, but I think we've been hearing a lot of confusing things from a lot of different sides, whether it's the mayor's office or DDPHE or public safety, about the collaboration between SET and STAR. But as far as we know, there's no longer fears that money currently allocated to STAR would go to SET or public safety in any way. But I actually would not dismiss that could be a threat in the future, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's not my understanding that we are in direct competition with them for that funding, but $4.3 million could certainly be transitioned into any number of better programs, including STAR, right? We're talking about the small percentage of calls that STAR is able to answer every time we've been talking about it in these meetings. It's because of our ability, physical ability, the number of vans we have at any given time. And yeah, we could use that money. So yes, not directly we're competing with them, but philosophically and maybe more, I would say we're in competition.
Hey, so I'm a little bit confused because I thought that the STAR program was transitioning to servicios. That's what we were saying last time. So am I understanding right? So the city is going to allocate the $2.3 million to STAR, but not let it go to servicios? Or can you guys better explain that to me? So they're keeping this program, but they're going to allocate the funds to the program, just not let the program go to servicios? And is it possible to remove it from the city bid, or is it not possible?
So the total funding that's been allocated to STAR was $4 million. So DDPHE, as we understand, controls that budget right now, the $4 million. 1.7 of it goes to MHCD or Well Power and Denver Health for the response. The 2.3 million, which is the part remaining, was what we wanted to go to Servicios de la Raza. So the money is already in STAR, it's just not being used right now. We wanted that money to go to Servicios. supposedly they have come to terms on finalizing a contract to give that $2.3 million to Servicios de la Raza. But they would run the community support side of the program, but the program as a whole would still live under DDPHE. But we've been confused by it too, because we're wondering where this money is. We've had demands of expanding that money and getting more money for STAR, but we're like, we're not using the money we have. There's $2.3 million that's on the table that we're not using as a program right now. And that's what we wanted to go to Servicios de la Raza, but it's a part of the program.
And yeah, Servicios de la Raza and the representatives have been at those community meetings the last several goes. We've received updates on that process. They're expecting, they detailed the timeline for when that's going to be available. Those services are going to be available. And I don't have those dates off the top of my head, but if you come to the next meeting, they'll likely be there with an update as well.
Just to back up on that, if Servicios, when that money pops through, are they ready to
So from what we understand, yes, Servicios actually was ready to go a year ago. Honestly, they had already started working out a budget, working staff, and programmatic functions as far as we understand. And where that's at now, it sounds like they've geared back up. Everything kind of hit an abrupt halt, but from what we understand, yes, they are ready to go. Last question, and then if there are any more, save them till the end. Just for the sake of time, we want to make sure we get everybody in. But yes, sir.
And just, again, this is my last question about Star Software. That money's going to be used to expand it past 20 bands, right? So it's not going to.
So from what I understand, we do plan to hit, what is the number we want to hit, over 20 vans by 2025?
Oh, I'm not sure. I didn't hear that.
So that's something that we would have to get clarity on. There has been conversations of expansion past 20 vans by a particular date. I guess we don't have the exact date, but yes, the plans of expansion to roll 24 hours, to have multiple vans that service all areas of the city and county of Denver. But these meetings, and everybody who signed in, I want to encourage everybody, make sure you leave your email address at the front, because we'll update you on all of this. If there's any questions that were asked here today that we don't have an answer to, or that we did not do a good job answering, we will figure out those answers and circle back to you for sure. For the sake of time, I want to pivot to the next panelists, but what I also want to say, please give these men a big round of applause for the work that they're doing in the STAR program. Thank you. So as we think about this, it is very dangerous for the success of a program that is supposed to be separate from law enforcement to be working with law enforcement. This does not build trust for a variety of reasons. If we have enforcement rolling around encampments where there may be activity going on that could interest law enforcement, or maybe there is an encampment of undocumented people, there is absolutely no way we can anticipate a program that works for law enforcement is not going to deliver harmful information of these encampments back to law enforcement. So I want to take a moment to get folks to wrap their mind around a bigger concept. We have a program in Colorado called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, and what this is a circumvention of conviction through different forms of diversion paths. We have two representatives from the LEAD program here today. We have Amy Kafuma, who is the lead care manager, and we also have Kevin Kelly, who is the DPHE Environmental Public Health Specialist. I'd like you to welcome these two to the panel. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate you coming. As our panelists get comfortable, I want you to, can you give me a bit of a background on the LEAD program, kind of the expectations of LEAD, where LEAD is at now, and kind of the overall purpose and the functions that it serves?
Definitely. How's everybody doing? Good to be here. My name's Kevin Kelly. So to give a little bit of background, LEAD is a nationally used model. It's there's over 50 LEAD programs throughout the country. It started in Seattle in 2010 and has really moved to be that national model. And the whole idea is to divert people with behavioral health issues, so folks who are usually dealing with mental health and substance use issues, probably both co-occurring, to keep them out of the criminal justice system. And the model has really evolved over time. We've had LEAD in Colorado since 2018, so there's 5 sites now. LEAD is in Denver, Pueblo, Alamosa, Longmont, and the most recent one was Lakewood. They got stood up about a year ago. So LEAD's evolved quite a bit from when it first came to Denver. When we first started, it was just law enforcement diverting folks from low-level crimes like drug possession charges and prostitution into intensive wraparound services. In Denver, we partner with the Empowerment Program, where we have a representative today, and Amy, to provide those services. Starting in June of 2020, though, after hearing from the community, like Alexander, like Dr. Davis was talking about, we heard loud and clear that there was a desire to, whenever possible, avoid contact with law enforcement. So we also stood up a second avenue into the program through community referrals. And we try to take a really wide approach to what a community referral is. That really can be anybody self-referring themselves into the program or through other community agencies to say, hey, I'm dealing with these behavioral health issues. It leads to me being involved and making contact with the police. I need help with housing, with harm reduction services, things of that nature, so they can basically refer themselves into the program. The overall kind of focus of the program once you're in the services is definitely housing first and harm reduction based. Most of our folks who come to us, they're experiencing homelessness, so our first order of business is to get them off the street. Usually that looks like getting them into a motel for a couple weeks to a month while we look for permanent housing. And then while we're doing that, we look for permanent housing for them. Unfortunately, as you all know, there's a lack of affordable housing in Denver, so most of our long-term permanent housing placements are in market rate apartments, which is very expensive. It eats up a ton of our budget, but that's what we do for our folks, is get them into that long-term housing, and then from there we really approach their goals. There's no expectation that they're gonna try to reach sobriety or stop engaging in sex work or anything like that. They get to decide what their goals are for the program. Did you want to talk a bit about what some of the services look like?
Yeah, so I work at Empowerment as a care manager under this grant, and the services, we try to connect people to a lot of behavioral health services. Some of that's actually in-house at Empowerment. We have therapists. We offer classes from people experiencing domestic violence to working on recovery. We have clothing closet. We have a variety of resources as well as community partners. So we have like the SAMHSA grant housed with us, and we try to just get people connected, let them kind of lead and be support in a trauma-informed harm reduction approach, really meeting them where they're at.
You know, and that really triggers a thought for me. Both Kevin and Amy, you've heard the discussions about SET, about STAR, and these other programs about data sharing in-house. What is your policy around data sharing?
So we don't share data outside of the program. We have an internal database that we use to track all of our services and referrals so that we can track and show the work that we're doing and measure equity, make sure that we're providing resources to, we measure ourselves against Denver's jail population, so we want to see through that database, are we having a representative population, or is the population of LEAD representative of the population in jail, so that we know we're reaching those populations that are overrepresented in Denver's jail. So that's what we use to measure ourselves. We don't share that data with anybody else. The lone exception for that is we are partnering with the University of Colorado at Denver to do a third-party evaluation for the program. So they do have access to our data. They're going to be coming out with this evaluation of Longmont, Pueblo, Alamosa, and Denver actually this coming month. Be happy to share that with you all. So that is the lone exception to that data sharing. But outside of that, it all stays internal.
Do you have, or does your program cater to undocumented populations at all?
We don't check for documentation. We can certainly help people with services that are necessary, but documentation is not something anybody needs to show to engage in the program. We've tried to be pretty flexible in terms of criteria for qualifying too. So we've accepted folks really from all over the Denver metro area. We don't want to be kind of nitpicky about, you're on this side of Yosemite or something like that. So we try to be as flexible as possible when it comes to that, and definitely not checking anything like documentation.
And as we know, especially as we go further east, depending on what side of the street you get pulled over on, could determine whether or not you end up 20 miles away from your neighborhood or not, depending on what you get taken in for. So, no, I really appreciate that. And I guess, could you ever envision, or would there be, I guess, a conversation worth having around LEAD playing a role or some sort of intertwinement with the STAR program and as an alternative to an entity like SET?
I think with STAR, the question, and honestly, I don't know enough about the STAR program's plans for that long-term service provision that was discussed earlier, because I think that'll look a lot like the services we provide in LEAD. So right now, certainly happy to kind of bridge that gap while that's being developed. The one thing I will add to that, though, is we are a small program. We only have 3 care managers, Amy included in that, and that's created a lot of barriers in terms of how many new referrals we've been able to take at a time. So to give you an example, we've served, starting from February of 2019 to now, we've served 111 people. And the reason for that is because they're in our services for usually well over a year, because it takes that time to get set for housing, for employment, to get your mental health and medical health, physical health squared away. So because we're such a small program and we want to keep our caseloads low so that the care managers like Amy can keep providing great services that are impactful, it really limits how many folks we're able to serve. So that also would be a limitation to, we'd certainly be happy to help STAR out, but when they're taking 4,000 calls, there's just, I'm not sure how helpful we could be to them just in terms of the volume that they see.
So it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, the majority of our resources are intertwined with the criminal justice system. The organizations who are out in the communities doing the work, the organizations who are saving the lives, the organizations who are helping families and community members are the ones that need the funding, not organizations like SET that can pop up overnight and jump into a $4.5 million budget. Are there any questions for the folks from LEAD, from the Empowerment Group, while we have them here?
Where do we send money?
You don't need to send us money. We so in the interest of transparency, so we are funded through Colorado, so at the State Department of Human Services, and they've honestly been a great partner to work with. We are exploring those options to expand the program, applying for Caring for Denver dollars, SAMHSA dollars, things like that. So we are definitely looking to expand, but appreciate the offer.
Of course. Yes.
You're a city department through the safety department, but you're grant funded. Is that what you're saying? Did it mean, like, to Brian's question, right, of like where do we send money? I would say our taxes
Yes.
to the general fund, and why aren't you getting any of that funding?
Good question. So for those who couldn't hear, the question is basically where does the funding from LEAD come from, and where does it sit within the city? Was that the other question?
Yep.
Great. So yeah, it's a bit convoluted. So the Colorado Department of Human Services is the funder. That's through the long bill through the state legislature. LEAD's money comes from marijuana taxes, is what funds us. So that money goes to us being Denver, Longmont, Pueblo, and Alamosa. In Denver, the contracts, that money is routed through where I work, the Department of Public Health and Environment, and then we subcontract with the Empowerment Program to execute the actual LEAD contract. So the money actually comes through the state and then is subcontracted out through the city to Empowerment. Does that answer your question?
We have a question in the chat. It says, LEAD is a great idea, but this person does not know anyone that has benefited from the program. So their overall question is, how do you choose who would benefit? So I guess what makes somebody eligible for your program?
Great question. So eligibility really is just, are you dealing with behavioral health issues that lead to law enforcement interactions? And we've been, again, tried to be pretty flexible with what that means for individuals. I think the reason why, and it's a great question as to why don't you see the impact on a larger scale, is really program size. Only having 3 care managers who can take around 15 people at a time on that caseload really limits our impact. So we do our best to try to get our name out there, but when we do, we also find that we end up telling a lot of the people who come to us, sorry, we don't have room. So we do try to put our name out there when we can. The program fills up very quickly, and then we wind up having to tell folks, no, sorry, there's not enough space at the moment. So it is an issue for us, and it's why we're looking to expand the program, because honestly, there are hundreds and hundreds of people that could definitely benefit from the great work Amy and her team does. It's just that issue of capacity. So certainly understand the question and the frustration with that.
Are there any other questions? We have one more panel on law enforcement oversight. I want to make sure that I'm respectful of folks' times. We're at 7:28 now. Can we hang out for another 10 minutes? Do folks have another 10 minutes in there? All right, perfect. And if there are any questions that come up between now and then, please save them for the end. This goes for all panelists, all subject matter that's been covered this evening. We want to make sure that we're leaving here with the best understanding possible. So are there any further questions for the folks from LEAD before we pivot? No? Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Amy. So it's clear to me, you know, that based on the subject matter that we've touched on, that law enforcement accountability, that oversight is mandatory in the city and county of Denver. We need to have some level of checks and balances. We certainly can't expect the district attorney, who is the most influential player in the entire criminal justice system, who decides whether you get charged feloniously, whether you get charged with a misdemeanor, or whether you even get charged at all, is going to do things differently. We in Denver have an entity called the Office of the Independent Monitor and the COB. Unfortunately, these offices were created out of the horrific murder of a young man named Paul Childs in 2005 here in Denver. These offices were developed as independent entities of oversight, allowed to make recommendations as to the discipline of officers and sheriff deputies in the city and county of Denver. Myself, my organization, our community, we're not only the creators of this office, but we have been the sole champions in the strengthening of this office through several charter amendments that have been passed. But currently this office sits vacant. And I have with us today Al Garner. He's the former board chair for the COB. And him and I would like to discuss with you kind of where the Office of Independent Monitor is at, what oversight looks like within the office, and what to expect in the selection process moving forward for Denver's next independent monitor. So Al, if you don't mind, can you join us up here, please, sir? And can we get a round of applause for Al Garner? So Al, thank you for being here today. I know you actually have quite an in-depth knowledge of oversight in the city and county of Denver. You're familiar with the Matrix, the Citizens Oversight Board, and the Independent Monitor's Office. I'm wondering if you can give us, from your perspective, kind of a brief synopsis on why oversight is important and what the office and the role of the COB are to the community.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me. I'm going to give a small brief, a little more in depth of exactly what the Citizens Oversight Board, because a lot of times it's kind of misunderstood exactly where we fit in that process. So I'm going to be a little explicit about exactly what that COB does. Just read this brief portion here. The Citizen Oversight Board was created in 2004, as Alex mentioned, of 9 community members who are broadly tasked with assessing the effectiveness of the Denver Department of Public Safety's hiring, training, and disciplinary processes, making recommendations as appropriate. In order to do so, the board is granted regular access to public safety department leaders as well as confidential records. The board is also responsible for appointing by, with the consent of the City Council and the independent monitor, who shall serve at the pleasure of the board. The board meets twice monthly, first and third Friday of the month. All meetings are currently virtual, and we hold quarterly public forums as well. In short order, the COB is tasked with making sure that there's a hand in and their eyes on exactly how the different processes move within the Denver Sheriff's Department and the Denver Police Department. And it goes without saying that it's obviously something that was brought about from a tragedy, but is now a necessity in the city of Denver, and I think we have a good partnership with both those offices, DSD and DPD, as we work through the different levers of law enforcement in the city.
Thank you, Al. And I appreciate that. As far as the current selection process, Denver's been without an independent monitor for a little over a year now. And as we discussed in that time frame, we've seen a variety of things unfold, from protests being mishandled to unnecessary criminalization of our unhoused folks, and no accountability going towards the officers who are responsible for these actions. Can you kind of tell us where we're at in the selection process?
Yep, sure.
The new independent monitor?
Absolutely. The first thing I want to say is that although we have not chosen a new independent monitor to backfill our previous independent monitor, Nick Mitchell, we do have an acting independent monitor, Greg Crittenden, who's actually been with the Office of the Independent Monitor for quite some time, even before Nick's time. So while we have not yet chosen one, that office is not without leadership, and everyone in that office is still operating in the same way it would have and as it will act when we will choose an independent monitor. I wrote a couple of things down because this is a fast-moving process, and like we just said from the beginning, the process began when I was chair. The process is still going on now, we've chosen a new chair. The thing that I've mentioned from the beginning, and the thing that the Citizens Oversight Board has been very intentional about from the beginning, we want it done right versus quickly. And that's what's most important to us. So the time is not as important to me personally, as I would venture to say to the Citizens Oversight Board as well, as much as it is getting the right person in the room and the community both agreeing that that's the right person in the room. That being said, these are some things that have transpired over the past couple of weeks. Earlier this month, the COB was able to complete the city's lengthy contract approval process and hire an executive search firm. The first thing we did when we were looking for an independent monitor the first time was to hire an executive search firm. That executive search firm went out, located individuals. We dwindled that down to 3, which many of you were a part of and were able to hear those interviews with them. It came down to, we did not think that those 3 would be a good fit for this role, and so what we decided to do was actually look for a new search firm altogether and try to identify some more candidates that we think will fit what that job more entails and Denver's particular set of issues. During the long contract approval process, we also formed and required a screening committee, which includes representatives from different parts of the city and community. Their job is to work with the recruiter to review applications, conduct interviews, and present 3 highly qualified candidates to the board. Including on this committee is former independent monitor Nick Mitchell. We did this before. We included as I look around the room, I see a number of community people who were actually involved in that community piece the first time, and that's something that will be done this time as well. Over the past few weeks, we've been conducting stakeholder meetings to help the recruiter better understand the different aspects of the role and the ideal characteristics of a successful candidate. We're now working on processing the valuable input input we've received in putting together a job brochure, after which we will begin actively recruiting candidates. This is a very important part of the role and the effort to us. We are writing the job description and writing what the recruiter should be looking for, not just based on what the Citizens Oversight Board says, but also in conjunction with what the community as a whole would like to see as the search committee is looking for those candidates. We'll continue to accept applications until the position is filled. We're planning the following timeline, which this is important. The job posting in the second half of July, so that'll be in a couple of weeks, the job will actually be posted. The recruiter and screening committee will conduct interviews as appropriate through August and September. The COB plans to interview finalists and ensure the community has a chance to interact with them in October before a final hiring decision is made. The new monitor start date with this plan would be in October or November, although it could be sooner if the screening committee is able to quickly identify several excellent candidates. Throughout this process, community members are encouraged to reach us at cob@denvergov.org, and we're looking for as much input. But that gives you some idea of what we're looking at in timeline in terms of who should be involved and when.
I would also add, I was on those two calls actually earlier this week, with a heavy emphasis that this does not exclude anybody here locally. There's plenty of wisdom and expertise right here in our own community. So if there are candidates that we should be venting and running as community members, we definitely need to put them forward, because the last thing we need is to roll into 2023 in this same position. So we encourage any suggestions or community individuals who would be well qualified, coming from the background of community, coming from a background of being directly impacted, coming from a background of being a marginalized individual. So all of these things I'm personally pressing for, Nick Mitchell's pressing for, and other members of the subcommittee are directly pressing for. So you all.
Absolutely, and please do attend those meetings. They are public meetings. The first part of the meeting is public. Second part of the meeting is executive session. So please do come and make your voices heard during those. We actually have a committee meeting tomorrow, so you're welcome.
Are there any questions? Yes.
Nick is a rare individual by all means, and love him. Said go, and I'm curious, what kind of professional backgrounds are you looking at in this community for civil rights attorneys? What kind of life work experience do you think that kind of directs something toward this kind of position?
Yeah, the job description points out someone with either a master's degree or a JD, so you don't have to be a lawyer. But we are looking for folks who have a background with dealing with different city entities. In particular, some type of community work mixed with use of dealing with different things like STAR, sheriff's departments, police departments, and we need someone that understands the different stakeholders that are in the community, understand how to effectively communicate with them, as well as people who are used to looking through policy, making policy recommendations, understand language of policy, so those intricacies that deal with public policy as well as community are particularly the skill set that we're looking for.
And we also don't want somebody who's going to be in this just as a point of transition. We want somebody who's going to stick around. We don't want to be back in this position in another 2 or 3 years. Nick Mitchell was with us for 8. Prior to him was Richard Rosenthal, and those are the only 2 monitors Denver's ever had. So we want somebody who's in this for a good amount of time. Are there any other questions? Yes. Jump back here and then we'll jump to the chat. Yes.
I was just going to ask, what time is the meeting tomorrow?
At 10 a.m. Yes.
And is that both in person and via Zoom?
No, for now it's all Zoom. Thank you for, it's all virtual.
So in the past, we had some issues with the district attorney's office listening and respecting the recommendations of the independent monitor's office. What does that look like in Beth McKinnon's office working with you guys right now? Do you have any answer for that?
Do we have any answer for that?
Yeah, do you have an answer for what is your relationship relationship with Madam Ken's office, because right now she's not prosecuting or doing anything to any officer. So it's almost like having the Office of Independent Monitor in Denver has not, no disrespect to you, but I'm saying the office will recommend the discipline matrix, recommend firings, charges being brought on officers, but we're not seeing that happen in Denver, so I'm asking you, what is the relationship with the district attorney's office?
I'll answer it like this. I'll say this is why it is important to identify the right candidate that can be able to strike that balance with being able to work with the district attorney and craft those policies so that when there are recommendations, those recommendations can come to fruition. The independent monitor doesn't have the ability to make those changes. It can do exactly what it can do, which is to recommend them. I would say that our relationship, since I've been on the COB, has been good, and I think getting this person will help further that relationship so we continue that path.
And I would just add this too. Actually, I brought that up on the call. I was yesterday, 2 days ago. You know, encouraging folks to allow the monitor to think outside of the day-to-day norms of the role of that office. Yes, you can make recommendations, but you also have an entire toolbox. You have a district attorney, or at least you could develop a relationship with the DA. You've got a governor. You've got an attorney general. All three of which are also mechanisms of accountability. So whoever this new monitor is needs to be able to think, you know, if I can't get it done via this route, what are my alternative routes? Do I need community? Do I need to take it up a notch? So, I mean, those are things that we are discussing as well.
Can I add this, Alex? I'll say that remember that the city of Denver made an important turn in this last election when you chose to allow the COB to choose and manage the independent monitor. That's huge because that did not exist. And to me, that's the first step of along that continuum of allowing the independent monitor to become even that much more effective. So to your point, it's a very good question, but I think it's a step along that continuum of really being able to enforce those changes.
Yes, sir, Rob. We have a couple questions from the chat.
No, thank you, Chris. I just want to make a statement Chairperson Julia Richmond, and I really am appreciative of how transparent you have attempted to make it.
I'm very appreciative of just how transparent you have attempted to make this process. I know it's been a difficult process. You had 3 candidates. You brought them before the community. It didn't pan out. But I just appreciate that you're keeping community updated and engaged throughout this process. So, you know, I do a lot of complaining sometimes. I got to, you know, give some kudos where they do. So thank you to you and Julia and to Chairperson Richmond.
Absolutely, Doctor. You know, you've been involved since the beginning, and I'm glad to hear you say that, because definitely we've been very intentional about making sure this is not a COB only decision, but it belongs to everyone in the Denver community. Thank you.
I appreciate everybody coming out here this evening. This concludes our panel. Before we close, I want to remind folks that we're going to be doing one community meeting a month up through December. Some of the things you can look forward to. We know that we are in the middle of a violence crisis in our communities. Violence is on the rise. Gun violence amongst young people is soaring through the roofs. In this neighborhood right here, in Park Hill, in Montbello, on the south and west sides of town as well. And one of the things that I just want to bring up, we actually have the founder and executive director of Youth Empowerment Agency and Second Family Center in the house, Khadijah Locke. And she's going to be, please, round of applause. But one of the things that we're going to discuss in these panels moving forward is ways to keep our young people safe. And part of the barriers that are not being discussed are access to childcare, access to day camps, access to public facilities that can act as alternatives to school when school is out, when parents are at work. Khadijah can speak firsthand to these barriers. She can speak firsthand to things she has done to reduce violence in her community. And we expect the other panelists who are going to be speaking to hit just as hard. So stay tuned. If you haven't had an opportunity to sign the sign-in sheet, make sure you do that. Make sure your email is on there, and look forward for updates from us all moving forward. Thank you again for coming out this evening.
Hey everyone, this is Alex with Unicorn Riot. Thanks for tuning in to our live coverage of this event this evening in Denver, Colorado. The Denver Justice Project hosted a community meeting and panel to talk about public safety and reimagining police. So thank you to everyone who tuned in. And if you missed any of the stream, you can go to unicornriot.ninja and click on the article that is on the main page. And you can watch the stream from start to finish. And you can also check out all our other coverage on unicornriot.ninja. And if you appreciate our coverage tonight and any of our past coverage, we are powered by our audience. So if you are able to, we appreciate any financial donations. We're a nonprofit, so all of the donations are tax deductible. And yeah, thank you so much for tuning in.